Hello and welcome to the first OCR A-Level PE Sociocultural Studies revision screencast. Now the first focus is going to be on 3.1, which is going to be the emergence and evolution of modern sport. So we're going to have a look at how social and cultural factors impacted the development of sports and pastimes as we know them today, or going through certain age periods. So we'll start off today then. Our first key focus, we're going to have a look at the social and cultural factors shaping the characteristics of and participation in sports and pastimes in Britain. In particular, we're going to focus on the pre-industrial times here. So pre-industrial revolution, anything really for this specification pre-1850. So these are the ages we have to go through: pre-industrial, post-1850, 20th century Britain, and then 21st century Britain. Now, what is absolutely vital here, as you can see, is we've got kind of these time periods. Now, the good thing about this is that the social and cultural factors that kind of influence or shape the characteristics of sport through these periods are the same. Now, that is a good thing if going through those ages are the same and you know what they are, because ultimately you've got to learn 7 social and cultural factors and see how there's slight changes in how they influence the characteristics of sport through the different time periods. So really important we can do that. So in order to kind of put us into that position where we might have a way to memorize it, you might say that we've got to go through certain time periods. So we've got to go through pre-industrial, post-1850, 20th, 21st century. So you could say we've got to go through those times pretty quickly. You could say that we've got to go through you could say, as a way of remembering, we've got to leg it. Okay, so we've got to leg it through this time period. We've got to leg it. Okay, do you like that one? So you've got to leg it. Now, leg it is not going to be enough for us because we need to think about an acronym that starts off like this. So we've got CLEGIT. So CLEGIT is going to be the acronym that goes through all of the ages. Now, the first key is what you call a hierarchical acronym, because the top part of the acronym is absolutely vital for all of the social and cultural factors beneath it. So the top acronym is looking at class. Okay, so if we start off, we've got class, law and order, education, literacy, gender, income, time, transport. So really important. I'll go through the impact of this hierarchical acronym in a second. But before that, as you can start to see, the acronym changes slightly as you go through the ages, because it will then go to CPLEGIT, 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 because once we get to post-1850 industrial Britain, class will dictate whether people take part as an amateur, or what was called in this period a gentleman amateur, or as a professional. So that's really important there. That's just slightly how it changes. Some people just memorise its class because they know this, but I like to make sure that you don't forget that amateur and professionalism is dictated by class going through these ages. Okay, so that's your overview. That's the 4 kind of ages we've got to go through. They're the social and cultural factors. Remember that concept of leg it, cleg it, and then hopefully we can see exactly what I meant by this being a hierarchical acronym. So a hierarchical acronym, like I said, basically refers to this concept that you're going to have one key part at the top of it that is going to help then dictate all the things beneath it. So look in here. For pre-industrial times, for example, you might hopefully have already got some knowledge by now. We have to consider, first of all, class within pre-industrial Britain. How many classes were there? Okay, now obviously from that you'll be aware, as we'll go on to in the next slide in a second, that class will dictate the activities and roles that people took part in pre-industrial society. But on top of that, it will dictate whether class will dictate whether they have an education and literacy or not. It will dictate the income that they have. It will dictate the time they have to take part in sports and pastimes. And finally, it's going to dictate the transport they have. So these, as you can see, if you know about class and you know how many classes there are, you can link to activities that kind of allow you to build up through this section. If you go along here, exactly the same. Class will dictate how many classes are there in the next century or the next kind of period of time we're studying. That will dictate whether you're an amateur or professional. And of course, it will dictate education and literacy, income, time, transport. Same for here. It does exactly the same here. So you can kind of see there how important is it that you know how many classes there are. Absolutely vital, because it's going to dictate all the things down here and allow you to give examples where possible. So let's move on to the main part of the kind of screencast, which is going to be looking at social and cultural factors shape the characteristics of and participation in sports and pastimes in pre-industrial Britain. So here's our specification here. What we're going to have a look at then is have a look at the social and cultural factor, then explain kind of how it shaped the characteristics of, with examples of different sports in pre-industrial Britain. So let's start off then. These activities throughout this kind of pre-industrial period would be kind of vital for you to have a look at. So just as a kind of overview then, we've got things mob football, cockfighting, cricket, real tennis, smock race. So if I said to you now pre-industrial Britain, if we're going on to here, we're talking about pre-industrial Britain, we're talking about agricultural, seasonal time. We're talking about a rural kind of society where people spent lots of hours kind of working in fields, for example. So what we have to do is kind of have an understanding how sports kind of reflected that to an extent. So it starts off then, first part, class. So firstly, there's two classes, and this is split up into upper and lower class. Now, this was absolutely vital because class would dictate the activities that people took part in. So if you're upper class, you might take part in certain activities. Lower class, you might take part in other activities. But it could also dictate roles because sometimes people weren't excluded to certain activities by class. Sometimes upper and lower class, even in pre-industrial society, played together, but their roles were very different. Let's have a look then. So activities. Upper class then, they would play things such as real tennis, which were kind of had expensive equipment and complex rules. Whereas lower class played activities such as mob football, which was simple and violent. So there's the kind of things they would do. And the one sport at this period that kind of was almost a bit of an anomaly in the kind of both classes played together was cricket. Okay, so cricket in this situation, you have upper class would be taking part in this activities such as batsmen because they would be standing there hitting shots, whereas the lower class would be the bowlers and fielders, make up the numbers and go and chase the ball. Of course, this is another example in here. If you did want to make an extra note, it's sometimes in pre-industrial times women actually took part in cricket as well. So that's an example you could put in as an extra. Going on then. Law and order. So we've got to consider now law and order. At this point, was there any? Well, there was very little. Okay, so there's no police force, no RSPCA. So these two key things, this dictated the characteristics of sport in those times. So because there was no police force, activities were violent, and because there was no RSPCA, activities were often cruel. So let's have an example, see if we can apply these to sporting examples. So activities that were cruel, cockfighting as an example, could be animal baiting. On top of that, activities that were violent, where you have mob football. Okay, it's extremely violent, barbaric activities played by the lower class. Sometimes the legend would have that the only rule was no death. Okay, so you think these are really violent kind of activities. Going on. Education and literacy. Now, obviously, you see how important it is here. When you look back and you think, well, class was two classes, upper and lower. It's going to dictate the level of education and literacy, which will then dictate the characteristics of sport. So, upper class were literate, okay, whereas lower class were illiterate. So, literacy, level of literacy, dictated the complexity and whether the rules were written or unwritten. So, if we go on to here, upper class activities then led to the characteristics of their sport being complex with written rules. For example, real tennis, a very complex rule structure. On top of that, lower class had activities because of a lack of literacy. They had very simple unwritten rules. Didn't mean they had no rules. Okay, in mob football, for example, there were rules because there were certain ways you could score at each end of the village, but particularly they were simple and unwritten. So going on from there, gender. Now, pre-industrial Britain was a male-dominated society. However, class still did dictate activities for women. So we kind of had this concept now then, can you link between upper and lower class women to kind of differentiate the type of activities that they might take part in? So we have a look onto here. You've got upper class activities for women. They would do things such as archery because of it wasn't competitive. There was no contact. Whereas you're looking onto here, then lower class women would be more associated to events such as smock races. Okay, so smock races where the lower class women would kind of race for food and also kind of frocks that they could wear due to the fact they were very poor. Okay, so going on from there, income. So income obviously is going to be dictated by class. Okay, so which would then dictate the equipment and facilities that you would use. So obviously we're looking there then. So upper class used expensive facilities and equipment. For example, real tennis rackets and courts were expensive, sometimes built at the upper class houses, but also local market towns. Often just behind the market would be real tennis courts. Lower class activities were very simple and natural. Mob football, very simple, not much income required. Pig's bladder would be used as the kind of way to take part as a ball. So very minimal. So we'll leave it as that one for now. So time. So dictated class would dictate how much time you had. Lower class were on seasonal time, which meant that they were doing lots of harvest, loads of hours, looking at 75-hour weeks really, and you're looking at this kind of thing, thinking they're doing loads and loads and loads of hours, which meant that because of a lack of time for the lower class, their activities, the characteristics of these activities were occasional. So if we look at this, what did it mean? Well, if you were lower class and activities were occasional, if we go down to this bit here, that meant that you would do things such as mob football on specific holy days, such as Shrove Tuesday. So you see how you're talking about this? You're saying, right, lower class had very minimal time, which meant that activities were occasional. For example, mob football on Shrove Tuesday, which was a holy day, and it's still to this day celebrated in a surviving ethnic sport of Ashbourne football. Okay, so on top of that, upper class had lots of time, so they could do things over longer periods of time. And this, of course, hunting will carries through all of the ages as an activity. If we go on then, transport. So again, class would dictate transport. So if we look onto this bit now, we're saying upper class had horse and cart, okay, which meant that their activities were regional, whereas lower class were limited to travelling by foot, so it meant that their activities were local. So see how these the class of transport, upper class had it, horse and cart, meant that they could go regionally to the local towns, whereas lower class were limited to travelling foot, so their activities were local. So if we go on to this, upper class then could travel to market towns. But this meant that they could go take part in real tennis after the market had finished and have an afternoon playing or morning and afternoon playing real tennis. Whereas lower class activities were local, things such as mob football. And once you've got that basic distinction, it's also worth here having an understanding how transport could actually form the basis of activities, so the level of transport. So I've put into here, so if you make a note of this, transport could form the basis of activities because lower class people were limited to foot, for example. So what you had here is upper class families would employ lower class people, and they would actually act as messengers or footmen, which meant that they would run from one family to another delivering notes and messages. And this then led to this concept of pedestrianism, where the race walking, race running would take place. So it actually formed the basis of sports sometimes. You had rowing here. So what you'd have is people on villages or towns by the River Thames, okay, and they would then start on the one side of the River Thames and they would row across to the other side so that to take people across as a taxi service. It actually formed the basis of some of their sports, the lack of transport. On top of this, the upper class, of course, had horse and carts. This might influence the activities they played. So for hunting, for example, with the horses. It's just an example that transport dictated the activities played. It actually formed the basis of why they did certain activities, if you wanted to go a little bit above that. Okay, so, and I suppose also down here, when you're talking about transport, at this point, even if for lower class, they had no real transport to get to the local places. So obviously there were no rules anyway. So due to the fact there were no rules, like distinguishing, given a common rule book from mob football, it was very difficult to go and play in different villages anyway. So that is the key focus. These are the social and cultural factors. This is how they influence the characteristics of different types of activities. So what I'll have a look at now then, we'll have a little revision tester to see how you feel with that. So if I went over to here, revision, what are we looking for? Well, firstly, if we start off, C. Can you remember what that stood for? How many of these were there? What were they called? And can you then give activities for the different ones of these and then maybe roles on top of that? Next test. Al, was there any? Okay, why wasn't there? What wasn't there at this point? And then can you give some links to characteristics and sports that were played as a result of this? Okay, going on. E, can you remember what that is? Who had it? Who didn't? Okay, can you link that to the characteristics of the sports that people play? Remember, you're always looking for a double application here. An example of a sport linked to an upper class and lower class, and then trying to talk about those characteristics of them. G, can you talk about how women, can you give some examples of the kind of activities they took place, which was massively distinguished by class? On top of that, I, which class had it, which class didn't have it? Can you link to the characteristics of sport due to that and try and give two examples? Remember, we're constantly using, aren't we, these two examples here, real tennis, mob football. Going on, who had this, who didn't? And can you then try and link it to the characteristics and sports? Okay, finally, your last T, can you then start to look at this one, who had this, who didn't, and can you link it to the characteristics and sports? So you're really trying to think now on those. If you can do that, you're in a really good position to be able to answer questions on it. So hopefully you feel like you can have a good go at looking at pre-industrial Britain. Remember, the key thing on this, if you can link every social and cultural factor back to how many classes there were and give activities based on that, you're giving yourself the potential to get 2 application marks, your AO2 and AO3 in the exam. So you can really make sure you can do that. Okay, thank you.